c'est clair, ce n'est pas une grande surprise que je suis absolument désolée. Et s'il y a une surprise, c'est seulement que le niveau de hypocrisie, c'est absolument... Je suis bouleversée par ce niveau de mensonge pour appuyer une décision pour un oléoduc, que c'est une autre façon d'arrêter les choses qu'on doit faire pour protéger nos enfants contre l'urgence climatique. Last night, we voted in Parliament that we're in a climate emergency. We talked about what it means to hold to no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius, the urgency of that. We talked about the fact that the current target in which the Government of Canada is operating is completely inconsistent with holding to no more than 1.5 Celsius global average temperature increase. It needs to be said that for what Prime Minister Trudeau put forward today to work, he's betting against Paris working. There's no way to build an additional pipeline, more fossil fuel infrastructure for exporting raw bitumen out of this country. There's no way that works without expanding the oil sands. He admitted as much in his response to you when he said, well, within our Paris goals, we have a cap on the Alberta oil sands. It can't be said often enough or loudly enough that when Justin Trudeau or Catherine McKenna talk about their Paris targets, they are not talking about what we agreed to do in Paris. The Paris Agreement, the treaty, is clearly about holding global average temperature increase to no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius and as far below 2 degrees as possible. The information around which we first debated that we had an emergency motion October 15th in Parliament in response to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report. What that report told us that we didn't know in Paris was that 2 degrees is far too dangerous. That at 2 degrees we risk going into, well, past tipping points that lead us into self-accelerating, unstoppable, runaway global warming that undermines the very foundations of human civilization and leads to the extinction of millions of species. The IPCC report was hopeful in that it told us it's not too late. You can hold global emissions to no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius, but not on our current trajectory. It calls on us to go off fossil fuels 100% by 2050 and use dramatically less by 2030. Justin Trudeau's much vaunted cap on emissions, which was agreed to with Rachel Notley, so who knows if it has any status with Jason Kenney, involves an increase in emissions in the oil sands. Far from cutting emissions, it goes from 70 megatons a year with a cap at 100 megatons a year. I think what made me so angry was the cynicism of the bait and switch that every dollar that we make on this pipeline will go to green energy projects. Where are the dollars coming from to build the pipeline that we object to so strenuously in British Columbia? They come from our own public resources. This is public money, $10 to $13 billion additional on top of the $4.5 billion they already squandered buying a 65-year-old pipeline. They will build a pipeline to blow through our Paris targets, use our own money to do it, and then try to trick us by saying every dollar made on this project, as if there's ever going to be a profit, that's another question, is going to go to clean energy projects. C'est clair que maintenant nous sommes dans une situation d'urgence climatique. Pour laquelle raison, j'ai aucune idée pourquoi M. Trudeau ne comprend pas les niveaux d'urgence, ne comprend pas qu'on doit agir, on doit éliminer les émissions de gaz à effet de serre. But he's playing a shell game. Look here, look there, now you see it, now you don't. We'll take public funds, and some years from now, some may trickle down to clean energy. The insult to First Nations, and that was clear when he couldn't answer the question, does this meet the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People to free, prior, and informed consent? How could it? They keep approving the pipeline, declaring it will be built, over the objections of First Nations. Today from Vancouver, the Union of BC Indian Chiefs, the Chief Lee George Wilson of the Tsleil-Waututh announced they'll be going back to court. He said, we don't stand for oil. We're here to protect water and our land and life. So this is not over. This pipeline will not be built. The protests in British Columbia that you will see will rival anything that's occurred, including Clayoquot Summer of 1993. We know that diluent mixed with bitumen can't be cleaned up. We know we're in a climate emergency. Our government has betrayed us, and worse than that, they've betrayed their own children. Je suis disponible pour les questions s'il y a des autres questions.
Molly ou Mathieu, qui commence? Molly? Molly Thomas, CTV National News.
Hi, Ms. May. Do you expect legal challenges here or public demonstrations?
Both. Many. They've already, the Tsleil-Waututh and Musqueam and Squamish are very likely to go back to court. West Coast Environmental Law, when I was with them, many of the litigants from the original court case, when the National Energy Board decision came down. And at that press conference, the lawyers who'd worked on the first round of cases before the Federal Court of Appeal expressed the opinion that the National Energy Board record was so replete with legal errors once again that this would be something that would be a likely target for litigation. They've also, I haven't mentioned the southern resident killer whales over one of the reasons that they had that the Federal Court of Appeal found their decision so in violation of the law. But this will press the southern resident killer whales closer to extinction. They have a statutory obligation under the Species at Risk Act to protect the marine environment, and specifically an endangered whale like the southern resident killer whale. So just as we had after the original approval in December of 2016, did we have multiple court cases, I think 13 in all, running along three different major areas of law, constitutional, Indigenous rights, statutory questions around the Species at Risk Act, as well as administrative law questions about the fairness of the process. We're likely to see the same kind of legal actions once again.
I can see your frustration, and I saw Paul Manley tweet out that he'll do everything in his power to stop this. But at the same time, there was a poll out today that said the majority of BC residents support the pipeline. Are you listening to your constituents?
Yes, my constituents are fully. The distinction here is there's been a mountain of propaganda to tell British Columbians and all Canadians that this is in the national interest. It's not in the national interest. There's not a single economic study that's credible that says it's in anyone's interest. It's now a public project. Kinder Morgan left the field with their $4.5 billion, which they took laughing all the way back to the bank, at the point that they knew it was not a commercially viable project. That's why they left. And they managed to con our very gullible government into giving them $4.5 billion to avoid an unpleasant press conference where Kinder Morgan said, yeah, we couldn't get the ransom money in time, so we're leaving. The idea that in the month of, well, when they first made the threat, Kinder Morgan made the threat in the month of March that if they didn't have commitments by May 30th, they would pull out. But how on earth could any government give them what they claimed they wanted, which was a guarantee the project would go ahead, when we still had these multiple cases before the Federal Court of Appeal, likely to, as we knew at the time, quash the permits? The government didn't do the most logical thing, which I think every politician has known since time immemorial, to say, the matter's before the courts. We can't give you a guarantee. In any case, Kinder Morgan kidnapped their own project, not because they wanted to get a guarantee, but because they wanted to shoot the hostage. They didn't want to go ahead with building this thing. They didn't have long-term contracts. It wasn't viable. Now we have our government spending public money on a project for which there is no evidence it's in the national interest. None. Former Liberal Environment Minister David Anderson blew a hole through one of the claims that we keep hearing, and we heard it today from this stand from the Prime Minister, once again, without evidence, claiming that we could diversify markets. You know, the Aframax tankers that leave the port of Burnaby now, loaded with diluted bitumen, are going to the United States. There isn't a market in Asia. We would have to create a market in Asia, which would involve convincing Asian countries to build upgraders so they could process the bitumen, at the same time that we expanded oil sands emissions, thus violating the Paris Agreement. Yeah, my own constituents, by the way, live on the Salish Sea. And my own constituents include 4 First Nations who were never properly consulted about their Douglas Treaty rights. The Wasenak people, the Sartlip, Saut, Pocochin, Sekum, have specific rights under the Douglas Treaty, and they were never consulted about them.
Matthew Goyer, Radio-Canada.
Une question simple pour vous, Madame May. Ce soir, dans votre voix, j'entends de la colère, j'entends de l'indignation. Comment vous sentez-vous ce soir?
Oh, ce soir, je suis vraiment triste. Ça, c'est l'émotion le plus claire, presque pour quelques raisons, j'ai aucune idée pourquoi. Je reste avec l'espoir que actuellement, le Premier ministre est capable de chercher les faits, faire un grand examen, une étude et prendre la décision que ce n'est pas dans l'intérêt de personne de poursuivre cet oléoduc. Maintenant, c'est pour un été vraiment difficile pour les peuples autochtones de Colombie-Britannique. C'est difficile pour tous les groupes écolos, pour le gouvernement de Colombie-Britannique aussi. Nous sommes désolés. Même aussi, comme mon collègue Paul, je n'ai jamais laissé les bras contre ce menace. There isn't, by the way, we go through this over and over again, the science of cleaning up diluted bitumen. This is the government that said they'd look at science. And I have very good reason to think that they don't want the science being done by the Department of Fisheries and Oceans to be studied. They only want the science that's coming out of Natural Resources Canada to be studied. And the difference is this. Natural Resources Canada has done the same kind of tests as the one test that Kinder Morgan filed in the NEB process where I was an intervener. One test where they took a tank of fresh water, it's a 2-week period, in a place called Gainford, Alberta, a tank of fresh water to which they added salt, and then they poured diluted bitumen and said it floats like regular crude. Those tests have been replicated by Natural Resources Canada. Meanwhile, in Halifax, there's a facility that was built for the purpose of studying oil spills. It uses real ocean water at the Bedford Institute for Oceanography, and it replicates real ocean conditions. And the bitumen, which is a solid, which has been stirred into fossil fuel condensate to make it flow through a pipeline, in the presence of particulate matter and sand and bits of seaweed, like in the real ocean, according to DFO's studies, the bitumen separates, forms oil balls, and sinks. We don't have any way to clean up diluted bitumen in a freshwater environment, such as in the 800 watercourses that this pipeline will traverse. This is a different project than the one that was built 65 years ago, which still primarily ships a different form of crude. Diluted bitumen has had one major spill in the world that alerted people to the fact you can't clean it up, and that was the Kalamazoo, Michigan spill of Enbridges. So the Kalamazoo River will never recover. They gave up on trying to really clean it up. That's how we found out you can't clean up bitumen mixed with diluent. C'est une autre chose pour les médias québécois que je veux dire que je suis vraiment fâchée à mon ami Justin parce qu'il a dit que c'est une grande menace pour le transport de pétrole dans les trains. Et tout le monde se souvient le désastre lac mégantic. Mais l'oléoduc de Trans Mountain, ce n'est pas un oléoduc pour le transport de Bakken Shale. C'est seulement Bakken Shale qui a fait le désastre à lac mégantic parce que bitumen, le sable bitumineux, les produits bruts de sable bitumineux, c'est pas capable de faire un grand bol de feu. Et c'est impossible de faire un grand désastre avec bitumen dans un train. C'est seulement dangereux quand on a mélangé avec le diluant dans un oléoduc avec un accident avec un oléoduc. So I'd spent some time years ago patiently explaining to my friend Justin Trudeau that he really oughtn't to say that when you ship petrol by train it's very dangerous and then invoke the memory of Lac Mégantic, unless you're talking about Bakken Shale, which Greens believe we should not be importing into Canada at all. The Bakken Shale fracking is a disastrous thing for the environment. Methane emissions are huge, and it's also dangerous to transport. bitumen, and we, by the way, don't think there's any reason to put bitumen on a train, but if you did, it's completely safe. It can't blow up and it can't spill. So I just don't like my Prime Minister, who's my friend, lying to us. I really don't like it. Thank you.
Thank you very much.